Now let me show you a simple solution to resolve the callback hell problem. So first, let's delete the code that we don't need. I'm going to delete all the code in this synchronous section. Delete. And let's delete this comment as well as this one. So we want to get rid of this callback hell issue here, this nested structure. The technique we're going to use is to replace an anonymous function with a named function. What do I mean by that? Well, look at the second argument to this getCommit function. So this is the second argument, right? This is what we call an anonymous function, a function that doesn't have a name. Here's another example. As the second argument to getRepositories function, we have this anonymous function. So we're going to replace each anonymous function with a named function. And with this, we can flatten the structure of this code. Let me show you how that works. So we're going to start at the deepest level. Here is our first anonymous function. So I'm going to replace this with a function. Now this function gets an array of commits. And let's say here we want to display these commits on the console. So I'm going to call this display commits. It gets an array of commits and simply does a console.log. Now look at the signature of this function. It takes an array of commits, and here's the body of this function. This is similar to what we have here, right? So we can replace this with a reference to display commits. Note that here I'm not calling this function. I'm just simply passing a reference to this function, okay? Now, I want you to pause the video and apply the same technique 2 more times on getRepositories and getUser function calls. So pause the video, do this exercise, and then come back and continue watching. All right, so here on the call to getRepositories, we have another anonymous function. This anonymous function takes an array of repositories and then gets the commits for that repositories. So let's create a function called getCommits that takes an array of repositories. So this function has the same signature as this anonymous function, right? Now inside this function, this is the code that we want to execute. So I'm going to cut this from here, move it here, and then we can replace this anonymous function with a reference to our new named function. So getCommits. Now one more time. Here's our last anonymous function. So this anonymous function takes a user object and then gets the repositories for that user. So let's create another function called getRepositories that takes a user, and in the body of this function, we're going to call getRepositories with these arguments. Now this may look a little bit confusing at first because here we have a function called getRepositories, but inside this function we are calling another function which is also called getRepositories. But these two functions are different because the first one takes a user object, whereas the second function takes a string, which is the GitHub username, and a callback function. Okay, so back here, now we can replace this anonymous function with a reference to getRepositories. See what happened? We no longer have a deeply nested structure. So we call getUser. When we have the user, then we're going to get the repositories for that user. Now in this function, we pass the username. When we have the repositories, then we're going to get the commits for one of these repositories. And similarly, when we get the commits for one of these repositories, then we're going to display those commits. So this is how we read this code. Again, it's not ideal, but it's a little bit better than what we had before. At least we don't have the callback hell. Now, there is a better way to deal with asynchronous code, and that's by using promises, which is the topic for the next lecture.